Bruce Lee, between Jeet Kune Do and Wing Chun, by Jesse Glover, Bruce Lee's first student and assistant instructor. And he's dedicated this book to the man who taught him how to think, Mr. William H. Lee. Thanks for showing me the way, Jesse. And special thanks to Karen for all your help, and to Sherry for doing the editing, etc. At 6 o'clock there was a knock on the door, and when he opened it, there stood Bruce Lee ready to give him private instructions. This was his first introduction into Kung Fu. Jesse R. Glover, August 1959, Seattle, WA. Introduction. The author's history, Jesse Glover, in martial arts began in Seattle, Washington. He had rheumatic fever as a child and was weak and sickly. His physical illness and the dictates of an overly concerned mother robbed him of the simple pleasure of getting into childhood fights. These two pressing concerns, his mother and his condition, directed his interest toward adult forms of combat, and he became an avid follower of boxing and wrestling. He listened to boxing on the radio, watched wrestling on TV, and spent hundreds of hours reading all the material that he could find on the two subjects. All of the books that he read on boxing and wrestling stressed the need for better than average physical strength. Since he recognized his own limitations, he was about to give up on learning self-defense and became a fast talker when a friend of his, Larry Wing, introduced him to the art of Jiu-Jitsu. Larry told him that Jiu-Jitsu used principles of leverage that enabled a small weak person to defend themselves against someone larger and stronger. Jesse Glover scurried down to the Seattle Public Library, checked out all the books that they had on Jiu-Jitsu, and studied each one until he had all the moves and the concepts committed to memory. Larry and Jesse used to spend several hours testing the techniques of each other, but neither of them had a functional idea of how leverage was supposed to work. The only available mats to practice on were located in the downtown YMCA. One day, when Larry and himself were at the Y practicing some of the moves that they had taken from the library books, a short, stocky black belt came in. He watched both of them go through their moves for a while and told them that the things that they were doing wouldn't work. He offered to teach them how to fall, but was reluctant to show them anything else. He taught them how to fall by throwing them with the crab throw. The crab throw is done with a leg scissor movement against the legs and the chest. It is a very difficult throw to fall from, and it is certainly not the type of throw that is used to teach basic falling skills to beginners. We remember something like this being told us by a friend, Hector, who was well versed in Taekwondo, and he had to spar with his instructor, and he threw some kicks or something like that and said to him, gotcha, and then the instructor did the scissor move on him like that. Sounds like it was something like that, and got him down. So this crab throw is done with the leg scissor movement. Yeah, it's the similar one that he's talking about, against the legs and the chest. It is a very difficult throw to fall from, and it is certainly not the type of throw that is used to teach basic falling skills to beginners. Jesse was into the Japanese idea that a person isn't supposed to show pain, and he went home on more than one occasion with bad bruises and severe headaches. He spent the hour-long practice sessions bouncing off mats that were thin and in need of repair. Years later, at his first formal judo school, he learned that the reason for his headaches and bruises was due to the black belt's failure to teach him the proper way to fall. He wasn't told to keep his chin tucked into his chest, and every time he was thrown, his head would bounce off the mat. He was so eager in those days to learn anything about martial arts that he willingly endured the pain. So this guy that was teaching him was actually incorrect. The bad teacher didn't really know what he was talking about, or what he was doing. The black belt came around for a month, and the only thing that Jesse learned during that time was that it hurts like hell to get thrown on poor matting. After the black belt stopped coming around, Larry and himself sent away for some cheap paperbacks on Jiu-Jitsu. The books were poorly written and the instructions were difficult to follow, but they did come up with a few workable moves, most of which were arm, wrist and leg locks. They worked quite well once they were secured, but applying them was very difficult. One day Larry moved away and his rudimentary practice of martial arts came to an end until a few months later when he built a falling platform in his basement. The platform was made from boards padded with rags and covered with old bedspreads. He spent hundreds of hours practicing the breakfall movements that he had learned at the Y until he was able to execute them with skill. He traded a hunting knife and some books for a judo gi top and a white belt, which added a touch of realism to his workouts. Sometimes instead of just falling, he would pretend that he was being thrown by an opponent. One day when he was playing at Collins Playfield, a kid told him that they taught judo at the place across the street. He wasn't quite sure what judo was, but he knew that it had something to do with jiu-jitsu. From that day forward, he spent a lot of time playing across the street from the judo place, and whenever they left the doors open and he'd venture inside and watch the activities. Most of the time he stood there watching for a long time before someone would ask him what he wanted. He was uncertain of his position and he would turn and walk away rather than ask if he could stay and watch. Sometimes he saw someone he knew, and if they spoke to him, it always seemed like he got to stay longer. He asked one of the Japanese kids that he knew if it would be possible for him to practice judo at Seattle Dojo, and he told him that only Japanese people were allowed to practice there. So he was really saddened by this news and tried to get some of the kids who practiced there to teach him. He got the same treatment from them that he had received from the black belt at the Y. They were more than happy to bend his fingers and throw him to the ground, but they wouldn't teach him any offensive moves. He finally grew tired of the treatment that he was getting from those kids and looked up a jiu-jitsu school in the telephone book. The school was owned and opened by a Sergeant Jorgensen, who was a member of the Seattle Police Department. When Jesse spoke to him about the cost of instruction, he said that the price was quite high. He knew that there wasn't any way that he could raise the money, and he asked him if there was some kind of work that he could do in place of payment. He said that he was sorry, but that he was in business and that the only payment that he could accept was money. He did, however, take the time to show him some moves that he could practice on his own. That Jesse could practice on his own. After spending an hour showing him the basics of his art, he gave him a small booklet on his method and sent him on his way. It was kind of him to show Jesse the basic moves, and he left him feeling that for the first time he had something concrete to practice. Sergeant Jorgensen's method was based on a lot of chopping movements, and he spent the next 2 years chopping the air as he fought a host of imaginary opponents. When he was 12 years old, he had a brutal experience that really provided the motivation to learn martial arts. Ronnie Fields, Sylvester Bennett and himself were on their way back to town from a dance at the Duwamish Bend housing project when they encountered a drunken Seattle patrolman. They just turned the corner from First Avenue and were heading up Jackson Street when they first spotted him. The patrolman was 2 blocks away, but it was plain to see that he was very drunk. He was reeling from one side of the sidewalk to the other and looked as if each step that he took was going to be his last. Suddenly, they all got scared because they didn't know what to expect. They were a block away from the patrolman when he first noticed them, and he immediately started screaming obscenities and waving his nightstick. Any thoughts that they had of trying to walk by him left them, and they ran. They turned down the alley between First Avenue and Occidental with the patrolman in hot pursuit. They were nearing the end of the alley when a prowler car passed by, and they could hear the tyres squeal as the driver slammed on the brakes, and Jesse figured that they had spotted their silhouette. Ron and Sylvester leaped into a couple of window wells and were hidden from view. The only place that Jesse could find to hide in was a doorway that had been sealed shut with bricks. The tyres of the prowler car screamed as it shifted into reverse and headed back toward the alley entrance. The door well was no more than a 6 or 8 inch indentation, and he had a clear view of both the patrolman and the prowler car as they entered the alley. The piercing headlights of the prowler car illuminated the narrow alley, and Jesse could clearly see the patrolman as he half ran, half staggered forward. He was now shouting, "Come on, you little black so-and-sos, or I'll kill you." Since Jesse knew that he could already see him, he stepped out and stood there fearfully, waiting for the unknown to happen. When the patrolman finally reached him, he asked where the rest of the little he uses an N-word, were, and told him that Jesse told him he was by himself. He screaming that he would kill the others if they didn't come out, and Sylvester and Ron stepped from their hiding places about the same time that the two men in the prowler car stepped out into the alley. Jesse was standing about 10 feet from Sylvester, Ron, and the drunken patrolman when it started. All of a sudden, the patrolman kneed Ron in the groin and began to kick him. Ron hopped around in a bent over position, trying to protect his body from further harm. Jesse turned away from one of the cops from the prowler car and yelled, "What's going on?" The cop spun him back around by the shoulders and told him to mind his own business. He was too scared to pay any attention to his command and turned around just in time to see Sylvester get hit flush in the mouth with a Sunday right. The patrolman was wearing a big square ring, and it caught the corner of Sylvester's mouth and taught what happened. The cop that Jesse had been talking to swung him around and told him to pay attention to his questions. He was in the process of telling him his address when he felt a rough jerk on his shoulder. He turned around to see what was happening and caught the full force of the drunken patrolman's nightstick across the lower jaw. The shock from the blow was so intense that he stood there unable to move. He felt as though he was in an unreal dream, but his mind was still able to function, and he knew that he somehow had to stay on his feet. Suddenly, the three cops were talking among themselves about what they were going to do with him. They asked Ron where he lived, and he told them that he lived on 18th and King. Finally, one of them said, "Let's take them out and dump them." They were less than 3 blocks on the waterfront, and he thought that they might dump us into Puget Sound. Jesse didn't know how to swim, and he really started to struggle when they shoved all to the back seat of the prowler car. Jesse knew that if they threw them into the Sound, it must be some sort of wharf, river, or creek or something, ocean, that they were as good as dead. Finally, they got Jesse under control, shoved him into the back seat with Sylvester and Ron. Jesse's mind was racing with thoughts of escaping, and he was all set to run as fast as he could when they opened the door to take them out. The prowler car went down the alley and turned to the left up Jackson Street. He was breathing a little easier, but he was still fearful of what they might have in store for them. The prowler car stopped at 18th and Jackson, and they told them to get out. They limped over to Ron's house and knocked on the door. When Ron's mother came to the door, she found Ron bent over holding his groin, Sylvester holding the corner of his mouth together, and Jesse trying to stop his mouth from bleeding. Mrs. Fields had a shocked look in her face as she quickly ushered them into the house and asked what had happened. Ron and Sylvester told her that they had been beaten up by the police. When Jesse tried to answer her question, he found that he was unable to talk. He couldn't figure out what was wrong with him until he went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. One of his teeth was sticking through a hole an inch below his lower lip, and 3 others were deeply embedded in his tongue. His mouth was full of blood, and it was very difficult to breathe. His first thought was that he wanted to get home where he knew his parents would make everything all right. Ron's mother called his mother, and she took a cab over to Ron's. When she arrived and looked at his jaw, Jesse heard her swear for the first time in his life. He's sure that she used every curse word in existence when she reported what happened to the police, the sergeant, over the phone. Jesse wanted to go home, but his mother said that he would have to go to the hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, they were greeted by 2 plainclothes policemen who kept trying to get him to say that the person who had beat us up was a night watchman. Jesse's mother told him that he couldn't talk and that they would have to ask him questions, which Jesse could only nod his head to. Finally, a doctor came in and looked at his mouth. He stuck his fingers into his mouth and pulled his teeth out of his tongue. The pain that followed was pretty bad, but he was finally able to talk. The 2 policemen took a statement and had him sign it. His mother was madder. Jesse's mother was madder than hell. And all she wanted to do was get her hands on the man who had hurt her son. They wired his mouth together, and he had to stay in the hospital for 2 to 3 weeks. When he left the hospital, he had one burning thought, and that was to somehow kill the man who had beat him up. The experience left him with a mixture of fear and hate toward the police that he had to deal with for the next 20 years. The way that his teeth were loosely held in his mouth made him even more cautious about fighting. The doctor told him when he left the hospital that one good blow to the mouth would necessitate the pulling of all his lower front teeth. He finally lost a teeth to an abscess when he was 30. By the time that he was 12, until he turned 22, he lived to get even with the man who had beaten him up. He was 22 years old when he finally ran into the drunken patrolman. He had played it over thousands of times in his mind how he was going to take him apart slowly with his hands. He had long since excluded the possibility of using weapons because he felt that it would be too impersonal. He wanted him to feel the fear and the terror that he had felt as a 12-year-old boy. The only thing that happened when he finally saw him was that he became disgusted with himself over all the time that he had wasted thinking about what he was going to do to this particular person. He ran into him in a downtown restaurant, and he saw that he didn't have the slightest notion of who he was. He was slightly less drunk than he had been that night in the alley, and he sat and stared at him for a full 10 minutes. With each passing minute, a year of stored up hatred drained out of Jesse, and when he finally got up and left, the only anger that he felt was towards himself for the 10 years that he spent living on the flimsy foundation of hate. As he pushed open the door to leave, he glanced at the man, and he knew that to waste him would be to waste himself. The one positive thing that came out of the experience was the knowledge that he'd never let himself be physically abused again. When he was 15, he moved to California. The first thing he did when he got there was attempt to enroll in a judo school in San Carlos. He was living with his father in Palo Alto, and the town didn't have any martial arts schools. The nearest school that he could find in a telephone book was the school in San Carlos. He hitchhiked a ride to San Carlos 3 times before he got up enough nerve to walk into the school. The first 2 times that he went up to the school were spent looking through a crack in a curtain. The 3rd time that he went to the school, he had made up his mind to walk into the place and find out what was going on. A minute after he had stepped through the door, he was approached by a man in a judo gi wearing a black belt. The man asked him what did he want, or what he wanted, and he told him that he wanted to study judo. He asked him if he was from the areas, and Jesse told him that he just moved down from Seattle. He asked Jesse then if he knew anything about Seattle Dojo, and he told him that he had been there a couple of times. When he asked who was the head of the school, the only thing that he could think of to say was that he was an older Japanese man whose name was difficult to pronounce. Finally, he said that he wasn't taking any new students at the moment, but that he could check back sometime in the future. Jesse left the school feeling depressed because he had failed again. 6 months later, he tried to gain entry into another school in San Jose. Several times he went to the school, and each time he was ignored. It was easy to walk in and sit down, but no one would respond to his questions, and it became apparent to me, or to Jesse, that he wasn't welcome there. Later, he met a police cadet who had a brown belt in judo. When Jesse told him of his burning desire to learn judo, he agreed to instruct him, but they didn't have a proper place to practice. Most of the techniques that he learned involved chokes, arm bars, and coming in for throws without throwing. He practiced with him for 2 months before he moved away and lost contact. Jesse's first opportunity to learn judo in a formal setting came after he had joined the USAF, United States Air Force. There were 2 ranked judo people teaching on Ramstein Air Base in Germany. One was a sergeant with the local German police force, and the other was an airman who assisted him. The sergeant was a short, blocky man with the kind of strength that would win fights for him even if he didn't know judo. He held the rank of 2nd degree brown belt. Most of what he taught was self-defense rather than sport judo. The assistant was a 6-foot skinny yellow belt who assisted the sergeant and took over for him when he was gone. The assistant was rather weak. It was difficult for him to execute any of the major throws, but his greatest liability was that he couldn't teach. The sergeant was so strong that none of the students could throw him even when he wasn't resisting. His low centre of gravity and his resistance to being thrown made it very difficult to learn. Jesse studied under these 2 people until he was sent on a 9-month job to France. He had read that France was a country that was high in martial arts, but he didn't see anything to support the claim the whole time that he was there. At the end of his assignment in France, he returned to Germany to find that the sergeant was no longer around and the assistant had been sent to another base in France. He still had a strong desire to learn, but Jesse no longer had a teacher. Sometime later, the Air Force got the idea that judo would be a good thing for its men to know, and they brought in a black belt master sergeant named French. It's kind of Ken, isn't it? He's in France, and then a person called French has a black belt and teaches him, I suppose. His assignment was first to train 1 man from each of the squadrons on the base. So Jesse told his first sergeant that he had a strong desire to learn martial arts and that he would like to be considered for the training, but he said that another man had already been selected. He's disappointed again. The man they had selected was named Trafton. He was a squadron jock, and he's sure that his interest in judo was directly related to the fact that he was going to be excused in the afternoons to practice while the rest of us had to work, or them had to work. When Trafton finished the course, he gave members a 2-hour lesson, and that was the last opportunity that Jesse had to study while he was in the service, or the Air Force. He made a vow to himself that the first thing that he would do when he returned to the States was to join a judo club and become a black belt. he goes back to America. The first thing that he did when he got discharged was to go to work for the Boeing company. The second thing was to join Seattle Dojo, the place where he had stood around looking in the door as a kid. Joining Seattle Dojo was what he considered his true entry into the martial arts. Judo salutations and falling came easy for him because of his earlier learning experiences. He was also able to escape from most of the lower belts throwing attacks with little effort. This almost reflexive escape behaviour was both a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing because it allowed him to escape from most attacks, and it was a curse because it made him reluctant to attack. His first 2 years in judo were average, and he found himself losing as many matches as he had won. He became a successful judo player after he had learned 3 hard lessons. The first lesson was to ignore the crowd and concentrate on the opponent. The second lesson was to disregard the rank and reputation of the opponent, and the third was to just go out and do the best that he could. His third year in judo was a good one, and after a hard summer of practice, he started to win tournaments. Between 1959 and 1965, he lost a total of 8 matches, and most of these were to black belts, while he was still a brown belt. In 1960, he started to lose interest in judo and he relaxed his training regimen. He had come to the art seeking an effective form of self-defense, but it had become apparent to him that only the most skillful judo men would have a chance in the street. Another reason for his loss of interest was the fighting that was going on to determine who was going to control the art in the US, the United States. His introduction to the striking arts of karate and kung fu finally led him away from the practice of judo. He had read a couple of articles in Chun And Jeet on kung fu and karate, and he was fascinated with what he had read. When Mas Oyama's book, What is Karate, was published, he was one of the first people in Seattle to purchase a copy. His meeting with Bruce Lee eventually led him even further from the art of judo, and his last 4 years of success and competition were the result of his earlier rigorous practice, because he trained very little in judo after 1961. Bruce Lee had captured a large portion of his attention, and he was determined to become good at kung fu. Chapter 1. He had first heard about karate while he was practicing judo from one of his judo teachers, Mr. Harry Hamasaki. He said that there were men in Japan who could break a man's neck with a single blow of their hands, but he didn't mention the name of the art, and it wasn't until later that he learned that karate wasn't an advanced form of judo, but a complete art of its own. Jesse first heard of the art by its proper name in 1958 from a judo green belt named Leroy Porter. Leroy helped a Korean black belt named Moon instruct at the downtown Y. Leroy and himself often talked about martial arts, and one day he mentioned Kempo Karate. Jesse had never heard of Kempo. Its style practice were taught by the famous Ed Parker. He'd never heard of Kempo or any other kind of karate, but he was excited by his description of it. He told Jesse that he had a book on the art, and that if he wanted to read it, he would bring it to his house. So Jesse urged him to bring the book as soon as possible, and he brought it by the next day. And Jesse spent the following 3 days reading it over. The book cover was black with a logo of a white circle that contained 3 white lotus blossoms. The author of the book was Hawaiian, and the book was published sometime during the Second World War. Kempo Karate reminded Jesse of some of the jiu-jitsu that he had seen. The major differences between it and jiu-jitsu was the type of kicks and the blows that were woven into the throws and locks. The text also contained 1, 2 and 3 main attacks, or 3-man attacks, plus a section on weapon defences. Next time Jesse saw Leroy, he cornered him and got him to tell him everything that he knew about Kempo Karate. When he saw that Jesse was really interested, he told him that he had another book that he could borrow. The second book, he said, had been written by a man named James Lee, and he had been one of Lee's students while living in California. This guy had been one of James Lee's students. After a little prodding, Leroy agreed to show Jesse some of what he had learned from James Lee. That would probably be James Yim Lee. Jesse was so impressed with several of the movements that he had him repeat them several times. The techniques that he demonstrated were completely foreign to Jesse, but they looked and felt deadly. After Leroy's demonstration, they talked for a long time about James Lee. Leroy told him that Lee had studied under a Professor Wong in San Francisco. He said that Lee had learned a great many forms at Wong's school, but that he had been concerned about the application in a fight and had finally ventured out on his own. Leroy said that Lee didn't claim to practice or teach any style, and simply called his art chop sil, which meant miscellaneous hands. Lee had taken certain moves from the forms that he had learned and had made them into strong and powerful techniques by applying the concept of force. He had developed good power in all of his moves and was capable of some amazing feats. He could stack up 3 or 4 pieces of marble and tell you which one he was going to break without damaging the others. Leroy said that Lee seldom failed to break the piece that he selected while leaving the other pieces intact. Lee's back fist was his best weapon, and with it he could easily break a 3-inch thick piece of wood. Leroy said that Lee had not restricted his practice to Kung Fu, and that he also had a brown belt in Judo and some knowledge of Jiu-Jitsu. Leroy said that Lee had visited most of the schools in the Bay Area and was confident that the method that he practiced was as good as any that was to be found. Leroy told Jesse that he would bring Lee's book over the next day, and he spent a restless night waiting. James Lee's book was a small paperback with a picture of him breaking something on the cover. The book's pen illustrations were crude, but they did convey a message of power and effectiveness. The text was very interesting reading, and on the back cover was a picture of a gentleman, and he was later to have the good fortune to meet Mr. Paul Bung.